He threw her out in the middle of the night. No warning, no apology. Just Damien Moretti standing in the marble foyer of their Fifth Avenue mansion, his jaw set like concrete, telling his 7 months pregnant wife to get out of his house before Elena came home. Not asking, telling. Vivian Carter Moretti stood there in her bare feet on the cold floor, one hand pressed flat against the swell of her stomach, and she looked at the man she had married, the man she had loved with the kind of love that doesn't know when to stop. And she understood, in the space of one breath, that nothing she said was going to change a single thing. That was the moment. Not the divorce papers, not the years that followed. That cold marble floor, those bare feet, and his eyes already looking past her toward the door, like she was furniture he'd grown tired of. If that had been you, what would you have done? If you're watching this right now, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Because what Vivian did with that night, with that humiliation, with nothing but her child and her pride, is going to stay with you. Now let's go back to where it all began. Vivian had never been naive about who Damien Moretti was. You couldn't marry a man like that and claim you didn't know. The way conversations stopped when he walked into a room, the way certain men wouldn't meet his eyes, the lawyers who never sent bills, the phone calls he took in the garage at 2 in the morning, voice low, door shut, and when he came back to bed his hands were always too cold and he never explained why. She knew. She hadn't needed a roadmap. What she had told herself, what she had believed, the way people believe in things that hold their world together, was that she was the part of his life that was different. That their apartment on the Upper East Side before the mansion, with its secondhand bookshelves and his terrible cooking and the way he'd fall asleep on the couch with her feet in his lap, that was real. That was the thing underneath all the rest of it. She had not been wrong about that. That was what made everything that followed so much harder to survive. They had met at a charity auction, which was the kind of place neither of them had any business being. Vivian had been there as a +1 for a colleague, wearing a dress she'd borrowed and shoes that were half a size too small. Damien had been there because one of his associates had made a sizable donation under a name that wasn't quite his, and appearances required his presence. He'd been standing near the bar, not drinking, watching the room with the particular stillness of a man who had learned very young that stillness was a form of power. She'd bumped into him reaching for a glass of water. He'd caught the glass before it tipped. She'd said something sharp about the acoustics making it impossible to hear her own thoughts, and he'd laughed. Actually laughed, surprised into it. Not the polished social laugh she would learn to recognize later, but something real and slightly ungraceful. They talked for 2 hours. She missed the auction entirely. She did not know, standing there in her borrowed dress, that Elena Vasquez had left him 8 months before, after 4 years of what his world considered a serious relationship. She did not know that he had not laughed like that since. She learned these things later, piece by piece, the way you learn the architecture of a house after you've already moved in. What she knew that first night was that his hands were careful when he handed her back her water, that he listened when she talked, that he had the particular loneliness of a man who did not know he was lonely, and something in her had recognized it the way you recognize a language you learned as a child and then forgot. By the time she understood the full shape of what she was walking into, she was already in love with him. And she had stayed because the man who fell asleep on that couch with her feet in his lap, that man was not pretend. She was certain of it. What she had miscalculated was how much space the past could take up in a person, even a person who believed himself free of it. They married 18 months after the auction. Not a large wedding. Damien didn't do spectacle for personal occasions, only professional ones. 30 people in a restaurant he'd privately reserved in the West Village, good wine, her best friend Rosa crying through the vows. Damien holding Vivian's hands like he was afraid she'd change her mind if he let go. She remembered thinking, this is enough, this exact thing. This is the whole world. For 2 years she hadn't been wrong. He was not a gentleman in the ways that soft men are gentle. He wasn't going to bring her flowers unprompted or remember the name of her least favorite coworker. He forgot things. He was unreachable sometimes for days, and when he came back he brought the cold in with him, and she learned not to ask directly, but to wait until the cold thawed, and it always did. But he showed up. That was the thing. When her mother had been sick the year before last, he had driven 4 hours to Connecticut and sat in a hospital waiting room for 6 hours reading a newspaper. He wasn't actually reading, just to be there when she came out. He hadn't said much. He'd gotten her bad coffee from the vending machine and held her hand on the drive back, and that was all. She thought about that drive often, in the years that came after. The pregnancy had been unplanned but not unwanted. She had told him on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen, hands wrapped around her coffee mug, watching his face. He'd gone very still, that stillness of his, and she'd felt the old tightening in her chest, the one that knew him, the one that was always braced. Then he'd crossed the kitchen and put both hands on either side of her face and said, "Okay." Just that. Okay. But the way he said it, like something in him had rearranged. She had cried unexpectedly, and he'd held her there in the kitchen until she stopped, and he didn't say anything about it or make it awkward, just held her. That was October. By February, Elena Vasquez was back in New York. Vivian did not know about Elena for the first 3 weeks after her return. Those 3 weeks had their own particular texture in her memory, the way certain weeks do, after the fact, when you understand what was happening underneath the ordinary surface of them. Damien had been distracted. She had attributed it to business, to the particular pressures of the organization he ran, to the fact that February in New York was brutal that year, and he hated the cold in ways he'd never fully explained. He'd been sleeping less. She'd wake at 3, 4 in the morning and find his side of the bed empty and the light from the living room edging under the door. She'd gotten up once and stood in the doorway, and he'd been sitting on the couch with his phone face down on the cushion beside him, and his forearms on his knees and his head down, like a man arguing with himself. She'd said his name. He'd looked up, and there was something in his face. Not guilt, exactly. Something more like a man who has just been handed a choice he didn't know he was going to have to make. "Go back to bed," he'd said. "I'll be there in a minute." She'd gone back to bed. He hadn't come. Rosa was the one who told her. Rosa, who knew people, who had lived in New York her whole life and had radar for things moving under the surface. They'd been at lunch, and Rosa had set down her fork with a particular deliberateness and said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not fall apart in this restaurant." Vivian had put down her own fork. Elena Vasquez had come back from Milan, where she'd spent the last 3 years. She'd reached out to Damien. She was staying at the Mercer. People who knew things, people in that particular overlapping world of old money and organized power that Damien occupied, were saying she'd come back for him. Vivian had sat with this for a long moment. "How long have you known?" she asked. "A week," Rosa said. "I needed to be sure before I said anything. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry," Vivian said. Her voice was even. She was 7 months pregnant and her back ached and the water glass in front of her was sweating. Rings onto the white tablecloth, and she was choosing, in that moment, not to come apart. "Tell me what you know." She'd gone home that afternoon and waited for Damien. He'd come in at 7. She'd been sitting in the kitchen. Not waiting aggressively, not staged. She'd actually been going through financial documents for a tech startup she was consulting for, but her focus had been gone for hours and she hadn't made dinner and there were no lights on except the one over the table. He'd stopped in the doorway. "Elena's back," she said. Not a question. Something crossed his face. Relief, she thought, and hated herself for noticing it. The relief of a man who doesn't have to find the words. "Yes," he said, "and you've been seeing her." He didn't answer right away. That was its own answer. "We've talked," he said finally. "How many times?" "Vivian." "How many times, Damien?" He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and he looked at his hands for a moment, and she understood. Even then, even with everything pressing at her from the inside, that he was not lying to her on purpose. I was a man who had never been good at this particular kind of honesty. Not because he was dishonest, but because he was someone who had spent his whole adult life making decisions unilaterally and then living inside them without having to explain them to anyone. "She said she made a mistake," he said, "leaving." "And?" "And I don't know," he said, which was the truest thing he could have said and the most damaging. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach, the way she'd gotten into the habit of doing. She felt the small shift of movement underneath. Their son, though she hadn't told Damien yet that the ultrasound had confirmed it, had been waiting for the right moment, which now sat somewhere in an alternate life she was no longer living. "What are you going to do?" she asked. He didn't answer. She nodded. The way you nod when the answer is already in the room and nobody needs to speak it. I need you to be honest with me, she said. Whatever you decide to... I need you to not make me into the woman who didn't see it coming. Give me that. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she thought she saw it again, that thing he had shown her in the kitchen in October. Some version of him that knew exactly what he was holding and what he was about to throw down. I don't want to hurt you, he said. That's not the same thing as choosing me. He had nothing left to say to that, because it wasn't. She had hoped, in the 2 weeks that followed, that he would choose her. She was not proud of how much she had hoped it. She had spent those weeks very carefully, not falling apart in front of him, continuing to go to her consulting work, eating right, sleeping when she could, letting Rosa take her to prenatal yoga on Saturdays like the world was not tilting under her feet. She had not begged, she had not threatened, she had not shown him the full weight of what she was carrying, because some part of her believed, stupid, stubborn, certain, that he would see it anyway, that he would look at her and the child between them and feel the gravity of the thing and come back. He came home on a Wednesday night in March, later than usual, and he was different. Not cold, he wasn't cruel in that way, but resolved. She could see it in his shoulders before he even spoke. I need you to leave, he said. Not, I've made a decision, not, we need to talk. Not even, I'm sorry. Just, I need you to leave. She'd been standing in the bedroom doorway, and she didn't move. Tonight? I think it's better. I'll have the lawyers. There will be arrangements. You won't be left without resources. That's not... He stopped. This isn't about punishing you. I know what it's about, she said. She looked at him for a long moment. He was standing near the window, not touching anything, not pacing, just standing there with his hands at his sides, in the way that meant he had settled the argument with himself before he walked in the door, and there was no opening left. The baby, she said. I know, he said. Do you? Vivian. His voice went rough. I'll provide for... I'm not asking about money, she said. The silence was significant, not the silence of someone searching for words. The silence of someone who has decided something and cannot be reached past the decision. She went and got her coat from the closet, her handbag, the folder of documents from the nightstand. She moved carefully, the way you move when your hands are not entirely steady, and you cannot let anyone see that. He watched her from across the room and did not move to stop her. At the front door, she stopped. She didn't turn around. She wasn't going to give him that. The image of her face in this moment. Whatever he remembered, it wasn't going to be that. You think you're correcting a mistake, she said. Her voice was level. She was almost proud of it. You're not. She walked out. The elevator was empty. She got in and the doors closed, and she stood in the mirrored box of it and watched her own reflection for 17 floors. And she did not cry, not yet, because the cold air of the lobby would help and she needed the cold. Outside, the March wind came off the avenue like a hand. She stood on the sidewalk with her coat open because she hadn't managed the buttons, one hand on her stomach, 7 months and 2 weeks along, the city enormous around her. She thought, okay. She thought, he doesn't know what he's done yet. She thought, my son will know who he is because of me, not because of this night. She hailed a cab. She gave Rosa's address. She sat in the back seat with her coat finally buttoned and her handbag on her lap, and the city sliding past the windows in all its lit, indifferent beauty, and she made herself a promise. One promise, simple and permanent. She was going to build something, not to prove anything to him, not to wound him, not to make him regret what he'd done, though that would come. She was going to build something because her son was going to need a mother who hadn't let a man's worst night become the end of her story. That was the promise. She kept it. 5 years is enough time to become a different person. It is not enough time to forget. Vivian Carter had learned that the hard way, in the small hours of too many nights to count, sitting at a desk in whatever city she happened to be in, a cold cup of coffee at her elbow, and a spreadsheet open on her screen in the particular silence of a sleeping child on the other side of a hotel room wall, when the memory of that March night would surface without warning. Not the pain of it anymore, just the image. Damien standing near the window, hands at his sides, resolved. She had stopped fighting the image years ago. You couldn't fight a thing like that. You just let it come up, acknowledged it the way you'd acknowledge a scar when you caught it in a mirror, and you went back to the spreadsheet. She had become very good at going back to the spreadsheet. Nexar Technologies had not been built on ambition alone. It had been built on insomnia, on stubbornness, on Rosa's guest bedroom for the first 4 months, on a series of calculated risks that had no business paying off as cleanly as they did. It had been built on the particular clarity that comes to a woman when she has nothing left to lose and a child coming and realizes, in that combination, that she is actually free. The first year had been brutal in the way that first years always are. Not dramatic, just grinding. She'd been consulting while 9 months pregnant, then nursing while building pitch decks, then learning to operate on 4 hours of sleep because the work didn't stop for the fact that she was doing it alone. She hadn't told Damien about their son after the birth. She had made that decision with her eyes open, and she had never second-guessed it, even in the moments when it felt like the hardest thing she'd ever chosen to carry. His name was Lucas. He had his father's stillness and his mother's eyes, and a mind that frightened his preschool teachers in the way that brilliant children's minds sometimes do. Not meanly, just with a range of questions they weren't equipped to answer. He was 4 years old when Vivian closed her Series B round. He was 4.5 when she moved them into a brownstone in Brooklyn that she had paid for with her own money, and she stood in the empty living room with him on her hip and looked at the light coming through the front windows and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. By the time Lucas turned 5, Nexar had offices in New York, London, and Singapore. By the time she brought the company back to its New York headquarters, a glass tower in Midtown that the architecture press had written about with a reverence she still found faintly absurd, Vivian Carter was not someone people looked past anymore. She did not plan to run into Damien. The charity gala at the Metropolitan was Rosa's fault, technically. Rosa had leveraged their old friendship into a seat on the organizing committee, and the organizing committee required corporate sponsorship, and corporate sponsorship required Nexar's logo on the program, and Nexar's logo on the program required Vivian's presence at the event. The logic was airtight, and she'd known it was a setup, and she'd gone anyway because she had never learned to be afraid of rooms. She wore dark green. Not because of anything symbolic, she'd grabbed it from her closet in the 45 minutes between leaving the office and the car arriving. Her assistant had done her hair. She had put on the kind of face that corporate New York expected her to wear in public, and she had ridden uptown in the back of a town car going over contracts on her phone, and she had not thought about the fact that Damien Moretti's name was also on the donor list until she was already walking through the entrance hall. Rosa, standing near the coat check, made a face that was both apologetic and completely unapologetic. "I saw his name on the list 2 days ago," Rosa said. And I figured you'd handle it better than I could tell you to." Vivian looked at her for a moment. "That is an interesting theory." "You look incredible," Rosa said. "Go prove it to the room." She had. That was the thing about 5 years of building something. You stopped needing the room to go quiet when you walked in, and because you stopped needing it, it did. She moved through the cocktail hour with the particular ease of someone who has stopped performing ease, speaking to a senator's chief of staff about infrastructure policy, and to a tech journalist about Nexar's new urban data initiative, and to a museum board member about nothing at all, because sometimes that was what the room required. She was 20 minutes in before she saw him. He was standing near the far end of the hall, and she registered him before she consciously recognized him. The particular stillness, the way the space around him bent slightly toward him, the way conversations in his vicinity had a different temperature. He was wearing black. He was thinner than she remembered, or maybe just different thin, not diminished, but worn down in the way that certain pressures wear people, like stone under water. He hadn't seen her yet. She gave herself 3 seconds. Not to compose herself, she was already composed. Just to decide what her face was going to do, and then to stop thinking about her face entirely. Then she turned back to the museum board member and resumed the conversation about nothing at all. He found her 40 minutes later. She was standing near one of the tall windows overlooking Fifth Avenue, holding a glass of water she wasn't drinking, when she heard him behind her. She knew his approach before she heard it. Some animal part of her still cataloged him, and she resented that about herself with a mild, manageable resentment. "Vivian." She turned. He looked worse up close. Not devastated. He was still Damien Moretti. He still held the room. But there was something behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. Something that looked like a man who had been paying a bill for a very long time. "Damien," she said. a pause that had 5 years of weight in it. "You look," he started. "Don't," she said. Not unkindly, just flatly. "Skip that part." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Okay. What do you want?" "I didn't know you'd be here." "I believe you," she said. "What do you want?" He looked at her for a moment with something she couldn't quite name and didn't particularly want to. His hand moved slightly at his side, a gesture that went nowhere, like he'd started to reach for something and stopped himself. "How are you?" he said, which was not what he meant. "Excellent," she said, which was true, and also not what either of them was talking about. Someone passed close behind him, and he shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, putting his back to the room. Old habit, she remembered, the way he always positioned himself to see approaching angles. The gesture was so familiar that something moved in her chest, and she categorized it and filed it and kept her face exactly where it was. "I heard about Nexar," he said. "What you built." "Yes." "I didn't—" He stopped, tried again. "I didn't think that I could." "That's not what I was going to say." "What were you going to say?" He didn't answer, which was, again, its own answer. "The company is doing very well," she said, with a pleasantness she'd spent 5 years perfecting. "Thank you for asking. Enjoy your evening, Damien." She moved away from the window before he could respond, and she did not look back, and she found Rosa and requested the car 20 minutes ahead of schedule, and in the back of the town car going downtown. She looked out the window at the city and breathed deliberately and told herself that the tightness in her chest was anger, which was manageable, and not grief, which was not. It was probably both. She knew it wasn't over when Marcus Webb came to see her the following Thursday. Marcus was Damien's attorney, had been for years, the kind of attorney who operated in the specific gray zone where organized money and legitimate business shook hands. He was 60, compact, precise, and she had always found him faintly exhausting. He came to her office unannounced, which told her something, and he asked her assistant for 15 minutes, which told her something else. She gave him 10. "He knows," Marcus said, settling into the chair across from her desk with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing his words by weight. "About the child." Vivian set down her pen. "Does he?" "He hired someone after the gala. He didn't tell me he was going to do it. I want to be clear about that." Marcus had the expression of a man who was embarrassed on behalf of his client and managing it professionally. The investigator was thorough. "Of course he was," she said. "Lucas is 5 years old," Marcus said. "The dates are obvious." "Yes." She folded her hands on the desk. "What does he want, Marcus?" "He wants to see the boy." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, 42 floors down, the city moved without caring about any of it. "No," she said. "Vivian." "He made a choice," she said. "He made it when I was 7 months pregnant and standing in his foyer with no coat. That choice had a cost. The cost is that he doesn't get to walk back in on his own timeline." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He had the expression of a man who agreed with her and was professionally prevented from saying so. "He can pursue this legally," he said. "He can try," she said, "and I will fight it with every resource I have, and I have considerably more resources than I did 5 years ago. You can tell him I said that." Marcus nodded slowly. "He also wanted me to convey—" "I know what he wanted to convey," she said, "and whatever it is, I've heard it. It's 5 years too late." She stood, which ended the meeting. Marcus stood as well, tucked his leather folio under his arm, and paused at the door. "He's in trouble," Marcus said. "Not as advocacy, just as information. The kind that doesn't stay contained." She looked at him. "I'm not his problem anymore," she said. Marcus left. She stood at the window for a long moment after, looking at nothing, and then she went back to her desk and picked up her pen and went back to work, because that was what she did. The trouble Marcus had mentioned had a name. Several names, actually, but the one that mattered most was Vincent Caruso. Vivian heard it for the first time 3 weeks later, from a source she maintained at the city's financial crimes unit, a relationship she'd cultivated carefully over 2 years because good intelligence was good business, and because she'd grown up watching what happened to people who operated without information. The Caruso Syndicate was out of Philadelphia originally, now spreading north, and they had decided that New York's current instability Damien's instability represented an opportunity. She had noted this information and filed it. What she had not noted, because she didn't know yet, was that Vincent Caruso had also noted Nexar Technologies and the woman who ran it, and the fact that the woman who ran it had a particular history that might make her useful. She found out on a Thursday afternoon when her head of corporate security, a former FBI agent named Diane Park, came into her office without knocking and closed the door behind her with the careful precision of someone carrying something fragile. "We have a problem," Diane said. Vivian looked up. "Someone has been running surveillance on the building," Diane said. She pulled up footage on her tablet and set it on the desk. 3 separate vehicles in the last 10 days. Different plates, same operational pattern. Vivian looked at the footage. The cars were ordinary. That was the point. "Not law enforcement," Diane said. "The pattern's wrong for that. Too loose, too long." "Who?" Diane hesitated, which meant she knew and didn't want to say it. "Diane." "The plates track back to a shell company," Diane said. "The shell company tracks back through 4 layers to a logistics firm in Philadelphia with documented ties to the Caruso organization." The room was very quiet. "They're watching me," Vivian said. "They're watching the building," Diane said. "And your home and Lucas's school." Something happened in Vivian's chest that she hadn't felt in years. Not fear exactly, but the thing that lives next to fear, the thing that is colder and more precise. She looked at the image on the tablet, a dark sedan, ordinary, patient. "Escalate the school security today," she said. "Don't tell Lucas, don't alarm his teachers beyond what's necessary." Her voice was steady. She was very focused on keeping it that way. "Who knows about this inside the company?" "Just me." "Keep it that way for now." She thought for a moment. "Get me everything you have on the Caruso operation, and I want a full security audit. Building, home, vehicles, by end of day." Diane nodded and left. Vivian sat very still for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and did the thing she had promised herself 5 years ago she would never do. She called Rosa. "I need Damien's private number," she said when Rosa answered. A silence on the other end. "Vivian, someone is watching my son's school, Rosa." The silence went a different kind of still. "I'll send it to you," Rosa said. She didn't call him that night. She sat with it, because she had not survived the last 5 years by making decisions out of the hot center of a moment. She put Lucas to bed herself that evening, reading to him longer than usual, staying in the room after he fell asleep the way she hadn't done since he was very small. He slept with his arm thrown out to the side and his chest rising and falling with the total ease of a child who did not yet know that the world required vigilance. She watched him for a long time. Then she went to her home office and opened every file Diane had sent her on the Caruso organization. And she read until 2 in the morning, and by the time she was done, she understood the shape of it clearly enough to be certain of one thing. This was not about her. This was about Damien. She was leverage. Lucas was leverage. The realization made her furious in a way that was clean and clarifying. She called him at 7 the next morning. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake, which meant he'd been expecting this or something like it. "I know about Caruso," she said without greeting. A pause. "Where are you getting—" "That's not your concern. What I need to know is how long this has been coming and why my son is in the middle of it." "Vivian." His voice was different on the phone, closer somehow, without the room around it. "How long have you known?" "Long enough." "How long have you?" Another pause. She could hear him breathing. She could hear the weight of something he was deciding how much to tell her. 3 months, he said. 3 months. She let that sit between them for a second. "And you didn't think to— You made it very clear you didn't want contact." "I didn't want you in my living room for dinner," she said. "This is not the same category." "No," he said. "It's not." "Fix it," she said. "Whatever it takes, fix it." "I'm working on it." "Work faster," she said. "He's 5 years old, Damien. He doesn't know what any of this is. He doesn't know who you are. And if something happens to him because of your world bleeding into mine, I will not be reasonable about it. Are we clear?" He said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough in a way she didn't remember. "Nothing is going to happen to him," he said. "That's not good enough." "I know." She hung up. She sat at her desk with her phone face down in front of her and her hands flat on the desk surface, and she breathed in, out. The morning light was coming through the window at an angle, and somewhere in the brownstone she could hear Lucas waking up, could hear the small sounds of him getting up and going to the bathroom, and the ordinary reality of it was almost unbearable in its fragility. She had built every wall she knew how to build. She had made every calculation. She had gotten herself and her son to a place where the past was supposed to stay past. And still it had found them. Because it always did. Because she had made a son with a man whose world didn't know how to leave people alone. She got up. She started the coffee. She called Lucas's name and heard him answer, and she made herself sound normal, because whatever was coming, he wasn't going to carry it. That was the one thing she could still control. The point of no return came 11 days later, and it did not announce itself. It came as a phone call at 3:47 in the afternoon from Diane, short and flat and stripped of everything but the essential information. A car had followed Lucas's school van that morning. The driver had peeled off before reaching the school, but not before Diane's team had photographed the plate. The plate matched an associate of the Caruso organization who had 3 known violent incidents on his federal file. They had followed her son. Vivian was in a board meeting when the call came through. She had a standing rule about interruptions. There were none, not during board sessions. Diane had overridden it. She looked at the message on her phone under the table. She read it twice. Then she set the phone down, and she looked at the 7 people sitting around the table with their presentations and their quarterly projections, and she said very calmly, "We're going to need to resume this tomorrow morning. I apologize for the interruption." She was out of the room before anyone could respond. In the elevator, she called Damien. He picked up before it rang a second time. "They followed the school van," she said. The silence on his end had a specific quality. Not surprise. Something worse than surprise. The silence of a man whose worst calculation had just proven correct. "Where is he now?" Damien said. "Home. My security team has him." "Stay there. Don't tell me what to do," she said. "I need you to understand something." Her voice was even. Frightening, maybe, in how even it was. Whatever arrangement you have in your head about how this gets resolved, about what you owe and what you're going to do and how you're going to handle the Caruso problem, add this to it. She stopped, made herself say it plainly. They know about Lucas. They know who he is, which means they know he's your son, which means this has moved past a business dispute, and I will not be managed, and I will not be patient, and I will not sit in my house waiting for you to handle it on your timeline. "I know," he said. "Do you?" "Vivian?" His voice broke slightly on her name, just slightly. "I know." She hung up for the second time. In the lobby of her building, she stood for a moment with the city at her back and her phone in her hand and the full weight of the thing settling over her. She had run from his world once. She had built new walls. She had made herself unreachable. And his world had simply waited and sent a car to follow her child's school van on a Tuesday afternoon, and now there was no version of this she could manage from a distance anymore. She walked to her car. She gave the driver the address of the brownstone. She sat in the back seat and watched the city move outside the window, and she made herself think clearly, because clarity was the only thing she had ever been able to count on. Damien Moretti was going to have to finish what he'd broken, and she was going to have to let him close enough to do it. That was the part she hadn't figured out how to survive yet. Damien was already at the brownstone when she got there. That was the first thing that caught her off guard. Not that he'd come, but how fast. His car was parked half a block down, unmarked, and he was standing on the sidewalk outside her front steps with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the street, scanning, the way she remembered him scanning every room they'd ever entered together, cataloging exits, measuring threats. The habit of a man who had learned very young that safety was something you manufactured, not something you were given. She got out of the car before the driver had fully stopped. "I didn't say come here," she said. "No," he agreed. "You didn't. Lucas is inside." "I know." He looked at her then, straight on, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen at the gala. The polished surface was gone. What was underneath it was older and less managed. "I need to come inside, Vivian. You don't get to need things from me." "Someone in my organization gave Caruso your address," he said. Low, flat, like a man reporting a weather event. "Not just the office building, this address. Your home." The air between them went cold. She looked at him for a moment without moving. The street was ordinary around them. a woman walking a dog, a delivery truck idling at the corner. The whole normal architecture of an afternoon that had nothing to do with any of this. "Come inside," she said. Diane was in the kitchen with Lucas when they came in. Lucas was at the table with a glass of apple juice and a book. He read the way other children breathed, constantly and without being asked. And he looked up when Vivian came through the door. And then his eyes moved past her to Damien, and he went very still in the way he sometimes did, the way that always reminded her of something she tried not to think about. "Hey, Bug," Vivian said. Her voice was entirely normal. She had learned to do that. "Can you go up to your room for a bit? Take your book." "Who's that?" Lucas said, looking at Damien. "A colleague," Vivian said. "Go on." Lucas looked at Damien for another moment with the frank, unfiltered assessment of a 5-year-old who had not yet learned to make his attention polite. And then he picked up his book and his juice and went upstairs without argument. His footsteps on the stairs were small and deliberate. Damien watched him go. His jaw was tight. Something was happening in his face that he wasn't letting out, and Vivian watched him not letting it out, and she turned away because she could not afford to feel anything about that right now. "Talk," she said to Diane. Diane had the look she got when the information was bad, and she'd already processed her own reaction to it and was now purely operational. "The address leak happened 6 days ago. I traced it through our building's external access logs. Someone pulled the emergency contact file on Lucas's school enrollment. The file had this address. Whoever pulled it had credentials that looked legitimate but were issued 3 weeks ago under a name that doesn't correspond to any current employee." "A plant," Vivian said. "Inside Nexar," Diane said. "Yes." The kitchen was quiet. "How deep?" Vivian said. "I don't know yet. The credentials had limited access, HR systems, basic records. But they were inside the building for 3 weeks and we didn't catch it until I was already looking." Vivian turned to Damien. "You said someone in your organization gave them my address. How do you know?" "Because Caruso's number 2 called me this morning," Damien said. "He used this address as proof of what they have. It was a message." "What kind of message?" He looked at her steadily. "The kind that means they want me to know they can reach what I care about." The word care hung in the kitchen. Neither of them addressed it. "What do they want?" Vivian asked. "Territory, port access. 3 shipping routes I currently control." He pulled out a chair from the kitchen table and sat down, not with ease, but with the deliberateness of a man whose body was carrying more than his face was showing. "They've been building toward this for 18 months. The access to your address was theater. They want me to understand the stakes." "The stakes being my son." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. "And who inside your organization gave it to them?" He said nothing. "Damien." "I have a suspicion," he said. "I need to confirm it before I say it out loud." "You need to confirm it before—" She stopped, breathed. "There is a man connected to the people threatening my child, and you're sitting on who it is?" "I'm sitting on an unconfirmed name," he said, and his voice had an edge in it now too. "Because if I'm wrong, and I move on it, I burn the one relationship inside my organization that's keeping this from escalating to something worse than a car following a school van. And if you're right," he looked at the table, then back up at her. "If I'm right, someone I've trusted for 11 years has been feeding Caruso information for the past 6 months." The kitchen absorbed this. Diane set her tablet down on the counter with a small, careful sound. "I can work the Nexar angle," she said. "Find the plant, trace what they accessed and what they sent out. But I need 24 hours. "You have 12, Vivian said. Diane nodded and left the kitchen. Vivian and Damien were alone. She made coffee because she needed something to do with her hands. He didn't ask for any, and she didn't offer it. She just moved through the mechanics of it, the grinder, the water, the particular smell of it. And he sat at her kitchen table and watched her in the way he used to watch her, the way she'd once found steadying and now found complicated. "When did you know Caruso was moving on you?" she said. "October." "That's 5 months." "Yes." "And you handled it how?" "I tried to negotiate a boundary, a territorial line that gave them what they needed without surrendering the port routes." He leaned forward, forearms on the table. "It didn't hold. By December they were pushing past it, and by February I understood they weren't interested in a line. They wanted everything." And instead of handling it before it got to my building, she said, you let it get to my building. I didn't let anything. You knew in October. She turned around. The coffee maker was running and the sound of it filled the kitchen, and she looked at him across the counter, and she was not going to perform calm anymore. You knew in October, and my son's school van was followed in March. And the distance between those two things is 6 months of you not picking up the phone. You'd made it very clear. I made it clear I didn't want to be your wife, she said. I did not make it clear that my child could be used as a playing piece, and I didn't need to know about it. Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, and she hated that, but she kept going. He is 5 years old. He reads at a 3rd grade level. He asks me every night what the stars are made of, and I have to look half of it up because he's already past what I know. And some man from Philadelphia sent a car to follow his school van because of choices you made 11 years before he was born. Damien sat with that. He didn't deflect it, didn't explain it away. He sat with it the way a man sits with a weight he's decided to stop putting down. I know, he said. Stop saying you know. What do you want me to say? I want you to tell me how we end this, she said. Not manage it, not negotiate a temporary line. End it. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere on the street, a car alarm went off briefly and then stopped. There's a federal task force, he said. They've been building a case against Caruso for 3 years. I have information they need, specific information, documented, that would accelerate the case significantly. She looked at him. You'd cooperate, she said. I'd cooperate on the Caruso piece. And in exchange? Immunity on specified matters. Limited. He paused. It's been on the table for 6 weeks. I haven't taken it. Why not? He looked at her in a way that answered the question, which made her angrier because she didn't want to be the answer to anything of his right now. Take it, she said. It's not that simple. The moment I open that door, Caruso's people will know within 48 hours, which means the window between when I commit and when they move against me is very small. How small? Small enough that it matters where Lucas is, he said, and where you are. The coffee maker went quiet. She poured a cup she didn't drink. You're telling me that the act of protecting us is the thing that puts us in the most danger, she said, for about 72 hours. Yes. So what's the plan for 72 hours? He said, that's what I need to figure out tonight. He left at 9. Lucas had come back downstairs for dinner, and Vivian had made pasta, the simple kind, the kind she made when she didn't have any attention to spare for cooking. And Lucas had eaten it with the focused efficiency he brought to everything and had not asked again about the man who'd been in the kitchen. He was perceptive in ways that sometimes frightened her. Not in a difficult way, just in the way that made her understand she wouldn't be able to manage information around him much longer. He noticed things. He filed them. He'd come back to them on his own timeline. She put him to bed at 8:30. He asked her what would happen if you dug a hole all the way through the earth. She told him you'd come out somewhere in the Indian Ocean, probably. He found this deeply satisfying and went to sleep. She went downstairs and found Damien still in the kitchen, on the phone, speaking in a voice too low to make out words. He ended the call when she came in. I need to stay tonight, he said. No. Vivian, I have Diane and 2 other people outside. I'm not alone. That's not... He stopped. His hand went through his hair, a gesture she recognized from years ago. The gesture of a man at the edge of what his control could hold. Let me be here. That's all. I'm not asking for anything else. She looked at him. She was tired in a way that went beyond the day. She was tired in the way of someone who had been braced for a very long time and could feel the bracing starting to cost her in ways it hadn't before. Couch, she said, and you're gone before he wakes up. Okay? She went upstairs. She lay in the dark and listened to the house and did not sleep for a long time. Diane called at 6:14 in the morning. Vivian was already awake. She took the call in the hallway outside Lucas's room, her voice low. I found the plant, Diane said. There was something in her voice, not quite shock, because Diane had trained the shock out of herself years ago, but something adjacent to it. Something that sounded like the professional management of a thing that had personally landed. Who? His name in our system is Peter Cho, mid-level IT contractor, brought in 8 months ago for the Singapore office integration. Clean background check. Good references. A pause. The references were fabricated. I traced the fabrication back through 2 cutout companies to a firm in New Jersey that has documented connections to... She stopped. To what? Vivian said. To the Moretti organization, Diane said. Not Caruso. Moretti. The hallway was very quiet. Say that again, Vivian said, but the plant inside Nexar was placed by someone inside Damian Moretti's own organization, Diane said. 8 months ago, before the Caruso threat was visible, before you had any contact with him. Another pause. Vivian, someone close to Damian has been running a parallel operation. They planted someone in your company before Damian even knew Caruso was moving, which means, whoever it is, they've been playing both sides for longer than anyone knew. Vivian's hand tightened on the phone. Where's the plant now? She said. Gone. The system credentials were wiped at 4 this morning. He knew I was looking. She hung up. She stood in the hallway for a moment with the phone at her side and the morning light just beginning to come through the window at the end of the hall, pale and thin, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes at the end of a long night, that she had been wrong about the shape of this. It wasn't Caruso who had come for her. Caruso was real and dangerous and moving on Damian's territory, but the thing that had reached into her company and pulled her address from a personnel file, that was something else. That was something from inside the house, something that had been watching her long before any of this surfaced, something that had used the Caruso crisis as cover. She went downstairs. Damian was awake, standing in the kitchen with his jacket on, phone in hand. He looked up when she came in and read her face immediately. What happened? He said. Not a question. The plan in my company, she said. Diane traced it. And? She looked at him. She watched his face as she said it. It traces back to your organization, Damian. Not Caruso. Yours. The effect on him was not what she expected. It wasn't surprise. What crossed his face was something worse than surprise. The specific expression of a man who has just had his worst suspicion confirmed. The blood went out of his face slightly. His jaw set. Sal, he said, barely above a whisper. Who is Sal? Salvatore Greco. He set his phone down on the counter with a slow, controlled movement that was holding something in check. He's been my operations chief for 11 years. You suspected him, she said. Last night, when you said you had a suspicion. I didn't want to be right. But you were. He said nothing. She crossed her arms. So your operations chief has been running a parallel operation, feeding your position to Caruso, planting someone inside my company, and positioning himself to benefit from whatever came next. And you almost sat on that because you didn't want to be right. I needed to be certain. My son's address was in that file, Damian. Her voice was flat and sharp and absolutely steady. Sal Greco knew where my son goes to school before Caruso did. He put someone inside my company 8 months ago. That means whatever this is, it started before any car ever followed a school van. This was a plan. She paused. Did he know about Lucas? Before last night? Did he know who Lucas was? Damian's silence was its own devastating answer. How long? She said. He looked at the window. I don't know how long Sal has known. I didn't tell him. But he's thorough. He's always been thorough. So for however long, she said, your operations chief has known that you have a 5-year-old son, and he has been positioning that son as a piece on a board. She stopped. And you didn't see it? No, he said, and the word cost him something visible. She had been angry at him in many ways over 5 years. She had been hurt by him, had rebuilt herself from pieces of what his choices had made of her, had managed him from a careful distance, and refused to be soft about any of it. But she had never seen him like this. Not the controlled stillness she'd married, not the resolved coldness of that March night, but this, a man who had just understood that his blindness had put his child at risk and had no defense for it. She almost felt sorry for him. She didn't have time to. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. She looked at it. One line, you should ask him what Elena knew. She looked up from the phone. Her face must have changed because Damian took a step toward her. What is it? She held up the phone. He read it. The kitchen went still in a way that had its own weight. What does that mean? She said. He didn't answer immediately. He read the message again. His hand, when he lowered the phone, wasn't quite steady. Damien, what does Elena have to do with Sal Greco? He looked at her, and she saw it. The thing he'd been carrying that she hadn't known he was carrying. Something older than last night. Something that had been sitting in the structure of the last 5 years without her knowing it was there. Elena came back to New York 18 months before she contacted me, he said. I know she stopped, recalculated. 18 months, that's before you and I were married, he said. She came back and made contact with Sal. The room moved slightly, or seemed to. She made contact with your operations chief, Vivian said, a year and a half before she came back to you. I found out 6 weeks ago, he said, from someone inside the organization who was cleaning house after they understood Sal was dirty. They found records. He paused. Elena and Sal have been in communication for 4 years. Through the whole time Elena was in Milan, through our marriage, through after. Vivian set her phone down on the counter very carefully. She thought about what that meant. She laid it out in her head the way she laid out quarterly projections, piece by piece, each one finding its place. Elena returning to New York after 4 years had not been impulse or rekindled feeling. It had been coordinated. Sal had been managing the pieces, feeding Elena information about Damien's state of mind, about the marriage, about the moments of vulnerability. Elena had not returned for love. She had returned because Sal had told her the timing was right. And Damien had thrown out his pregnant wife because Salvatore Greco had spent 18 months engineering the conditions for him to do exactly that. She played you, Vivian said. They both played you. He said nothing. And Elena? Where is she now? She left New York 8 months after you did, he said. I don't know where she is. After I found out about Sal, I understood what it was. 8 months, Vivian said. So she stayed long enough to make sure I was gone, and then she left. She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum for a moment, a gesture she didn't intend anyone to see. Damien, your operations chief and your first love ran a 4-year operation to destroy your marriage, and you spent 5 years thinking you'd made a free choice. Yes, he said, and you've known this for 6 weeks. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the windows now, fuller, and it landed on the table and the counters and the ordinary objects of her ordinary kitchen, and she stood in the middle of it and understood that the story she had been telling herself for 5 years, the story in which Damien had chosen Elena, had chosen wrong, had been weak and selfish and left her to rebuild alone, was true, and also not the whole truth. He had been weak. He had also been manipulated by people who knew him well enough to use his weaknesses like tools. Neither of those things canceled the other. Neither of them changed what she'd had to do alone. Why didn't you tell me 6 weeks ago? She said. Because I didn't know how, he said. Because there's no version of that conversation that doesn't also ask you to. He stopped. I didn't have the right. No, she said. You didn't. She picked up her phone. She called Diane. I need everything you have on Salvatore Greco, she said when Diane answered. And I need it in the next hour. And I need you to get Marcus Webb on the phone, Damien's attorney. Tell him we're moving on the federal cooperation today. She heard Diane absorb this. Today? Today, Vivian said. We're done waiting. She hung up. Damien was looking at her. The window I told you about, once I move on this, 72 hours, she said. I know. So we move Lucas today and we start the clock and we don't stop until it's done. She looked at him with the particular steadiness she'd built out of the worst years of her life. Can you do that? Can you actually finish something you started, Damien? Or are you going to need more time to be certain? It landed where she meant it to land. I can do it, he said. Then do it, she said, because whoever sent that text knows we're already behind, and Sal Greco knew I was asking questions before I asked them, and if we give this another 24 hours, we won't have a 72-hour window anymore. She went upstairs to wake Lucas. She stood in the doorway of his room for a moment before she went in. His room, with its stacked books and its constellation map above the desk, and the small blue lamp that he kept on all night because he was 5, and the dark was still the dark. And she breathed. Then she crossed the room and sat on the edge of his bed and put her hand on his back and said his name softly. And he stirred and opened his eyes and looked up at her with his father's stillness and said, Is it time? And she thought, yes, baby, it is absolutely time. They moved Lucas at 7 in the morning. Rosa came for him. That had been Vivian's call. Not a driver, not a security contractor, but Rosa, because Lucas knew Rosa's voice and Rosa's smell, and the way Rosa always had something in her bag that was specifically for him. And Vivian needed him to get into that car without fear. Rosa arrived at 7 with a bag of Lucas's favorite crackers and a calm face that had cost her something to arrange. And Lucas had looked at his mother and said, "Am I going somewhere?" "Rosa's for a couple of days," Vivian said, "like a sleepover." "Will you be there?" "I'll come as soon as I can." He looked at her for a moment. He was 5 and he was perceptive, and he knew something was wrong the way children know things. Not in detail, but in temperature, in the particular quality of the air around the adults in his life. "Okay," he said. The same word Damien had said in the kitchen 2 years before he was born. The same cadence. It hit her somewhere she couldn't afford to let it hit her right now. She hugged him in the doorway. Tight and quick, and then she let go before she couldn't. She watched the car until it turned the corner. Then she went back inside and became a different version of herself. The version that had no room for anything except what needed to happen next. Marcus Webb arrived at 8 with 2 federal agents Vivian had never met, and a third man who was introduced only as a liaison and who had the specific blankness of someone whose job it was to have no readable expression. They sat around the kitchen table, the same table where Damien had sat the night before with his forearms down and his worst suspicion unspoken. And Damien laid it out. He talked for 90 minutes. Vivian sat against the counter and listened and did not interrupt. What he had was substantial, documented transfers, recorded communications, a ledger that Sal Greco had kept, apparently out of his own particular brand of operational vanity, the need to record the scope of what he'd built, that detailed 6 months of coordination between his office and the Caruso Syndicate, port schedules, shipment manifests, personnel movements. The ledger had been pulled from a secondary server 3 days ago by a man inside Damien's organization named Tomas, who had been quietly building his own exit strategy and had decided that the most valuable thing he could carry out the door was the evidence that could end Sal Greco. Tomas had delivered it to Damien at 2 in the morning 2 days before Vivian ever called him, which meant Damien had come to the gala already carrying this, had looked at her across a crowded room already knowing the shape of what was coming and had said nothing, because he hadn't known how to say it, because he hadn't known what it would cost her to hear. She noted this. She filed it. She would come back to it later when there was a later. The federal liaison looked at the ledger for a long time. Then he looked at Damien. "This covers the Caruso Network's Northeast operation comprehensively." "Yes," Damien said. "And Greco." "Entirely. We'll need the source, Tomas, to be available." "He's already in protective custody," Damien said. He understood the terms before he handed it over. The liaison exchanged a look with one of the agents. The look meant, "This is real." The look also meant, "This is going to move fast." "The immunity agreement your attorney submitted," the liaison said. "It's under review. We can have a preliminary response by this afternoon." "I need more than preliminary," Damien said. "I need a decision by noon." "That's not... Once I've committed to this, Sal will know within hours," Damien said. "He has people in places that I can't fully account for. The window between my commitment and his response is short. I need the agreement in place before that window opens." A pause. "Noon," the liaison said. "We'll have something by noon." They left. Marcus stayed. He sat at the table and looked at his coffee and did not immediately say anything. "How bad is the immunity agreement?" Vivian asked him. Marcus looked up. "It's narrow. Covers the Caruso cooperation specifically. There are aspects of Damien's other operations that remain exposed." "Meaning what?" she said. "Meaning he walks away from this cleaner than the last 10 years should allow," Marcus said carefully, "but not clean." "There will be additional cooperation required," Damien said, "on other matters. The federal relationship doesn't end with Caruso." Vivian looked at him. "You're agreeing to be an ongoing asset." "I'm agreeing to dismantle the pieces of what I've built that can be dismantled without destroying the people who work legitimate parts of it," he said. "It's not a simple transaction." "Nothing about you has ever been simple," she said. He almost smiled. It didn't make it all the way. The call from Diane came at 10:47. Vivian was in the living room going through Nexar's security protocols with her head of digital infrastructure, Damage assessment from the internal plant, what had been accessed, what needed to be rebuilt. When her phone buzzed and she saw Diane's name and picked up immediately. Sal Greco left his apartment at 9 this morning, Diane said. My contact in Damien's organization flagged it. He took a car to a building in Red Hook. He's been inside for 40 minutes. What's in Red Hook? A Caruso-connected logistics company, Shell Incorporated. A pause. Vivian. He knows we're moving. Someone told him. Vivian was already on her feet. How? I don't know yet, but the timing is too tight to be coincidence, Vivian said. Yes. She went to the doorway of the kitchen where Damien was still with Marcus. She held up the phone. He read her face. Sal's running, she said. He was out of the chair before she finished the sentence. The next 4 hours were the longest of her professional life, and she had once navigated a hostile takeover attempt on a 48-hour deadline with food poisoning and 3 hours of sleep. This was different. This had a different gravity. Damien made calls she wasn't part of, in the living room, pacing in a tight circuit the way she'd never seen him pace before. He was a still man. His stillness was one of his primary instruments, and watching him move like this was like watching a load-bearing wall develop a crack. She could hear fragments, names she didn't know, instructions delivered in a clipped, flat voice that had none of the social register of the man she'd first met at a charity auction, and all of the register of something older and more specific. She sat with Marcus and went through the legal architecture of what was happening. Marcus was useful in the way that good lawyers are useful in a crisis. Not reassuring, not optimistic, just precise. He laid out what the federal agreement would and wouldn't cover. He laid out the exposure that remained. He did not tell her everything was going to be fine because Marcus had been in rooms like this before, and he understood that fine was not a guaranteed outcome. At 11:30, the liaison called and confirmed the preliminary immunity framework. Damien took the call in the kitchen, standing at the window, looking out at the back garden where Lucas's bicycle was still leaned against the fence from 2 days ago. He said yes. He said he understood the terms. He said he'd have his attorney review the paperwork within the hour. When he hung up, he stood at the window for a moment longer. Vivian watched him from the doorway. Done? She said. Done, he said. He turned around. He looked like a man who had just put down something he'd been carrying for a very long time and didn't quite know what his body felt like without the weight. What happens to Sal now? She said. The federal task force picks him up, Damien said. They've been watching the Red Hook building. They were already positioned. And Caruso? The ledger gives them enough for the Northeast network. Caruso himself will run. He'll try to get to Philadelphia, to the parts of his operation that are below the federal line. But the network will collapse without the New York corridor. He paused. It's not everything, but it's enough that he's not operational. Not here, not against you. She nodded. She thought about Lucas at Rose's, eating crackers and reading, unaware that the danger around him had been a built thing, engineered by a man she'd never heard of 18 months before it ever touched her life. What about your organization? She said. After. I've been thinking about that for 6 weeks, he said, since I found out about Sal. He looked at his hands for a moment. There are people who've worked for me for 20 years who are in legitimate operations. Import, freight, property management. I can restructure. There are parts I can't clean. I'll have to let those go, cooperate on what the federal relationship requires, and let the pieces that can't survive scrutiny fall. You're talking about dismantling most of what you built, she said. Yes. She looked at him. You built it for 20 years. I know what I built, he said. I also know what it cost. She didn't fill in what was implied. She didn't need to. At 12:40, Diane called again. Vivian picked up, heard the tone in Diane's first syllable, and felt her chest tighten. Sal didn't go to Red Hook alone, Diane said. He took 2 men with him. The federal team moved in at 12:15. They got Sal. But one of his men got out the back during the entry. The federal team is tracking him, but... A pause. Vivian, he had a phone. He made a call before they got to him. The call went to a prepaid number that pings off a tower 4 blocks from Rosa's building. The room went white at the edges. Get Rosa on the phone right now, Vivian said. Her voice was a different thing than it had been a second ago, stripped of everything except urgency. Get her on the phone, Diane, right now. She heard Diane dialing, heard the wait, heard nothing. Rosa's phone rang and rang. "She's not picking up," Diane said. Vivian was already moving. She grabbed her coat from the hook and her keys from the counter, and she was in the hallway when Damien came out of the living room at the sound of her movement, and she said 3 words. "They went for Lucas." He was already moving before she finished saying it. The drive to Rosa's was 22 minutes. It was the worst 22 minutes of Vivian's life, and she had some competition for that title. Damien drove. He drove the way she'd never seen him drive, not recklessly, nothing wasted, but with a focus that pressed the space inside the car tight. She was on her phone continuously. Diane had flagged the federal team. Marcus had a direct line to the liaison. 2 of Damien's remaining men he still trusted, men Diane had vetted in the last 12 hours, were already en route to Rosa's block. Rosa's phone had still not answered. Vivian called it 7 times. On the 8th attempt, it picked up. "Rosa," she said, "we're okay." Rosa's voice was controlled with visible effort. "We're okay. There were 2 men outside the building. My neighbor called it in. She saw them from her window. I got the call. I took Lucas to the stairwell. We're in the stairwell right now." "Don't move," Vivian said. Her hand was shaking. She put it flat against her thigh. "Stay exactly where you are." "There's someone in the hallway," Rosa said, lower. "I can hear them." "Rosa, don't open the door for anything. Do you understand me?" "Yes." "We're 8 minutes out." "Okay," Rosa said. Her voice had tightened. "Okay." In the background of the call, Vivian heard faintly Lucas's voice asking a question she couldn't make out. She heard Rosa answer him, low and steady, and whatever she said, it was enough, because he was quiet after. She was not going to come apart in this car. She was going to hold the phone and stay on the line with Rosa, and she was not going to come apart, because Lucas could hear through phone calls, and Rosa needed her voice to be the thing Rosa could anchor to, which meant her voice was not allowed to break. She held the phone. She looked at the road ahead of them. She breathed. Damien said nothing. He drove. They came around the corner of Rosa's block, and Vivian saw the 2 men immediately. They were standing near the entrance of the building in the particular way of men who are not trying to look like they're waiting, but are waiting, weight distributed, eyes moving, too still for pedestrians and too obvious for professionals. They had either underestimated the response time or they didn't care anymore, which meant they were operating out of desperation rather than plan, which made them more dangerous, not less. Damien's men arrived at the same moment from the opposite end of the block. The next 40 seconds were the kind of 40 seconds that happen in a compressed register, fast and slow at once, every detail arriving with a strange clarity. One of Caruso's men moved toward the building entrance. One of Damien's men cut him off. Voices were raised. The second man turned and ran, and Diane, who had come with the second car, was out the door before Vivian had fully processed that Diane had been in the second car. Vivian was already through the building door. The stairwell was on the left. She hit it at a run, took the stairs to the 3rd floor, came through the fire door into the hallway, and stopped. There was a man in the hallway she didn't recognize. Young, the kind of young that meant inexperienced, which meant scared. He was standing 20 feet from the stairwell door, and he was holding a phone, and he looked at her with the specific expression of someone who had expected to be doing something else with the next 60 seconds of his life. Vivian looked at him. "Get out of this building," she said. Her voice was steady in a way that had nothing to do with calm. It was the steadiness of a woman who had run out of runway and landed anyway, and was standing in a 3rd-floor hallway of her best friend's apartment building, and was not going to move from this spot until her son was safe. The man looked at her for a moment. Then he looked past her at the stairwell door, which had not yet closed behind her, and at whatever he could hear coming up the stairs behind her. He ran. Down the hall, all around this corner, gone. She went to the stairwell door on her left, the interior maintenance stairs, and knocked twice. "Rosa, it's me." A beat. Then the door opened and Rosa was there, and behind her in the dim light of the concrete stairwell was Lucas, sitting on the 2nd step with his book open on his knees, reading in the near dark the way he read everywhere. And he looked up when the door opened and light came in, and he saw Vivian, and his face did the thing it did when she'd been away too long and then returned. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just a small, specific settling, like a compass finding north. "Hi," he said. She crossed the stairwell in 3 steps and put her arms around him, and he let her, and she pressed her face against the top of his head and breathed him in, and he patted her back twice with the solemn, slightly awkward affection of a 5-year-old who was not entirely sure why the adults in his life kept needing to hold him today, but was willing to cooperate. Rosa had her hand pressed over her mouth. Her eyes were bright. "There was a man in the hallway," Lucas said from inside Vivian's arms. "He had loud shoes." "I know," Vivian said. "Rosa said we were playing a stairwell game." "Rosa's very smart." "I know," Lucas said with 5-year-old certainty. Vivian held him for another moment. Then she pulled back and looked at his face. Unfrightened, curious, slightly annoyed at having been interrupted mid-chapter. And she thought, this is what it was all for. Every spreadsheet and every sleepless night and every decision made alone in hotel rooms, and the moment on the March sidewalk, with her coat unbuttoned and the city enormous around her. This face, these eyes. "Okay," she said, "we're going somewhere else now." "Where?" "Somewhere safe." He considered this. "Can I bring my book?" "You can bring your book." "Okay," he said, and stood up. Damien was in the lobby when they came down. He had a cut above his right eyebrow that he hadn't had 40 minutes ago, not deep, but bleeding enough to have tracked down the side of his face, and he'd wiped at it with the back of his hand and not entirely succeeded. He looked up when he heard the elevator, and his eyes went first to Lucas and stayed there. Lucas looked at him. Vivian watched her son look at this man who was his father, and who didn't know him, and whom he didn't know, and she watched something move across Lucas's face. That particular perceptiveness of his, the thing that went still and observed and filed. "You have a cut," Lucas said. Damien looked at him. "I do," he said. "Does it hurt?" A pause. "A little." Lucas nodded, with the gravity of a 5-year-old rendering a verdict. "You should put something cold on it." Damien's face did something Vivian hadn't seen it do in 5 years. It went entirely unguarded for just a second. No armor, no control, nothing between the surface and whatever was underneath. And what was underneath was not what she would have predicted. It wasn't guilt, though that was there. It was something simpler and more devastating. It was the face of a man seeing something he had not known he was missing until it was directly in front of him. And it was real, and it was small, and it was asking him about a cut on his forehead. "I will," Damien said. "Thank you." Lucas nodded again and leaned against Vivian's side and opened his book. Vivian looked at Damien over the top of their son's head. He looked back at her. There was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said. Her phone rang. "Diane." "Federal team has Sal in custody," Diane said. "The second man from the building is in custody. Caruso's location is being tracked. He crossed into New Jersey 40 minutes ago. They're coordinating with the Newark field office." A breath. "It's collapsing, Vivian. The network is collapsing." "Lucas is safe," Vivian said. "Yes," Diane said. "He is." She hung up. She looked at Rosa, who was standing by the elevator with her coat on and her bag over her shoulder and 5 years of friendship in her eyes. "I need a safe house for tonight," Vivian said. "My cousin's place in Jersey," Rosa said immediately. "She's in Florida." "Good. I'll drive." Vivian looked back at Damien. He was still standing where he'd stopped, one hand at his side, the cut above his eyebrow still tracking red. And he was looking at Lucas with the expression of a man standing at the edge of a thing he doesn't know how to cross, and understanding, for the first time with his whole body, that he was the one who had built the distance. "Come with us," she said. "Not invitation, logistics. Until the federal team confirms containment. After that," she stopped. "After that, we'll figure out what after that means." He nodded. "Okay." She moved toward the door. Lucas fell into step beside her, one hand finding hers automatically, his book tucked under his other arm. His head already bent back toward the page as if the stairwell game had been a minor interruption and the story was waiting. Damien held the door. She walked through it without looking at him. Outside, the afternoon was ordinary in all the ways the afternoon had no right to be. Pale sun, wind off the river, the sound of the city moving around them without any awareness of the particular weight of the last 6 hours. Vivian walked to Rosa's car and got Lucas settled in the back seat and buckled his belt, and he immediately went back to his book, and she stood outside the car door for a moment with her hand on the roof. She was shaking, She hadn't noticed until right now. Her hands were shaking with the particular delayed reaction of a body that had held itself together through something and was now, in the first second of quiet, presenting the bill. She breathed. In. Out. The shaking slowed. She got in the car. In the front passenger seat, Damien sat with his hands on his knees and his jaw set and the dried blood on the side of his face. And he was looking straight ahead at the middle distance, the way he looked at things when he was deciding something fundamental. And she thought, whatever he decides, it cannot be undone now. None of today can be undone. The federal agreement is signed and Sal is in custody, and Lucas asked this man if his cut hurt, and all of that is permanent now. Rosa started the car. In the back seat, Lucas turned a page, and Vivian Carter looked out the window at the city sliding past and understood that the war was almost over, and that what came after the war was going to require a different kind of courage than anything she'd needed yet. The kind that didn't have an enemy to push against, the kind that was just the open ground of what remained, and the question of what you built on it. Rosa's cousin's place in Jersey was a 2-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaning shop that smelled faintly of solvent and old carpet, and underneath that, something that might have been lavender from a plug-in air freshener that had run out months ago. It was ordinary in the specific way that safe places often are, unremarkable enough that nobody would look for anything there, small enough that you could hear every door and every movement. Lucas was asleep by 9. He'd eaten 2 bowls of pasta from cans Rosa had found in the cabinet, and had asked no questions about where they were or why. Though Vivian knew the questions were collecting somewhere behind those careful eyes, building into a structure he'd present to her when the moment felt right to him. He fell asleep with his book open on his chest, and Vivian closed it and set it on the nightstand and sat on the edge of the bed for a while in the dark, listening to him breathe. The shaking had stopped hours ago. What had replaced it was a deep, bone-level exhaustion of a kind she hadn't felt since the early years. The years of nursing Lucas and closing funding rounds on the same days and waking at 3 in the morning to answer investor emails with one hand while the other held a bottle. The exhaustion of a body that has been spending reserves, it didn't announce it was spending. She sat with it. Then she got up and went to the living room. Damien was at the window. The cut above his eyebrow had been cleaned and taped. Rosa had done it, efficiently and without commentary. And he was standing with his arms crossed, looking at the parking lot below, with the particular stillness she'd spent 5 years trying to stop recognizing. Rosa was in the kitchen making tea nobody had asked for. She had the wisdom to stay there. Vivian sat on the couch. Diane confirms Caruso is in federal custody, she said. Newark field office picked him up at 11. I know, Damien said. The liaison called me. Sal's arraignment is tomorrow morning. I know that too. The apartment was quiet. Somewhere outside, a truck moved through the intersection below, and the headlights swept briefly across the ceiling. The federal agreement covers the next 18 months, Vivian said. What happens after that? Cooperation continues, he said. On terms we've already negotiated. There are assets I've agreed to liquidate. There are operations I've agreed to document. He paused. There's a significant portion of the Moretti financial holdings that will be tied up in legal proceedings for at least 2 years. Meaning you'll have less than you had. Significantly less. She nodded. She didn't say anything about that because there was nothing to say. The money had never been the point for either of them, and they both knew it. What happens to the people who worked for you? She said. He turned from the window. He looked tired in a way she didn't think was about today. The legitimate operations continue. Property management, freight logistics, 3 restaurants. I've been moving those into a clean corporate structure for 6 months. The people who work there keep working. He came and sat in the chair across from her. Not close, not far. The rest, I don't have an answer for that. Some of them will find their footing. Some of them won't. That doesn't sit clean with you, she said. No, he said. It doesn't. She looked at him. Good, she said. Not unkindly, just factually. It shouldn't. Rosa appeared from the kitchen with 2 mugs of tea and set them on the coffee table and retreated without a word. Vivian picked hers up and held it with both hands and felt the warmth come through. I need to ask you something, she said. Okay. When you came to the gala, you had the ledger by then. You knew about Sal, about Elena, about what had been done. She held the mug. What were you going to do if I hadn't called you? if the Caruso threat hadn't pushed things to this point. He looked at his hands for a moment. I don't know, he said. That's not good enough. No, he said. It's not. He looked up. I think I was afraid that knowing the truth about Sal and Elena, knowing that the marriage was taken from us by something engineered rather than just by my own failure, would give me an argument I didn't have the right to make. She waited. That if I came to you with the truth, it would look like I was using it, he said. Like I was saying, it wasn't entirely my fault, so give me another chance. He stopped. Even if it wasn't entirely my fault, the night I told you to leave, that was me. That was my hands and my voice and my decision. Nobody engineered that. Sal gave Elena the opening and Elena walked through it He stopped again. I walked through it too, without enough reason to, without fighting for what I had. The room was quiet. You're right, she said. He looked at her. You walked through it, she said. You had a choice, and you made it. The manipulation was real, but it worked because something in you let it work. And I spent 5 years understanding that, so yes. She set down the mug. The truth about Sal and Elena matters. It's part of the full picture. But it doesn't rewrite what happened in that foyer. I know, he said. Stop saying you know, she said. Old reflex. It came out before she could stop it. Something moved across his face. Almost a smile. Almost. Okay, he said. The truck in the intersection below moved through again. Or a different truck. The light swept the ceiling the same way. Lucas, she said. He went very still. He's going to ask questions, she said. He already is, in his way. He's 5 and he reads at a 3rd grade level, and he notices everything. He noticed you in the lobby without being told to notice you, and he's going to come back to that. He's going to ask who you are. What will you tell him? That depends, she said, on what you want to be. He looked at her for a long moment. His hands were on his knees and his back was straight, and the cut above his eyebrow had already started to bruise along the edge of the tape, and he looked like a man who had arrived somewhere after a long, costly trip and was still figuring out if he was allowed to put down his bag. I want to be his father, Damien said. That's not a title, she said. That's a practice. It's every Tuesday and every school recital, and every time he asks a question you don't know the answer to, and you look it up with him anyway. It's being there when he's sick and boring and it's not a crisis. She paused. It's showing up for the ordinary. That's the part you've never done. I know I haven't. Can you? He didn't answer immediately. She gave him the silence because she needed his answer to come from somewhere real, not somewhere quick. I don't know what kind of father I am, he said finally. I don't know what I'm capable of in that specific way, but I know I'm done with the life that made this week necessary. And I know that whatever I have to learn, I want to learn it. He looked at her directly. I'm not asking you for anything. I understand what you are to me now and what you're not. I know the marriage is over. That's done. I'm asking about him. She sat with that for a moment. She turned it over the way she turned over important things, examining it from multiple angles, looking for the place where it broke down. It didn't break down. You'll have to earn it, she said. Not from me, from him. And on his timeline, not yours. If he doesn't want to know you, I won't force it. If he does, I won't prevent it. She paused. But you don't get to disappear when it gets complicated. The first time something in your life makes it easier to not show up. You show up anyway. That's the condition. Yes, he said. I mean it, Damien. I know you do, he said. That's why it means something. She slept 4 hours. When she woke, it was still dark outside and the apartment was quiet, and she lay for a moment listening to the quality of the silence and identifying its components. Lucas's breathing from the other room, even and deep. Rosa's light snore from the pull-out couch. The refrigerator's hum. The absence of anything that required alertness. She let her body understand that it was allowed to be still. Then she got up, put on the kettle, and sat at the small kitchen table in the dark with her hands folded and let herself feel the full weight of the last week without managing it. She gave herself that, because she had learned years ago that there was a cost to managing everything, and the cost came due eventually, and it was better to pay it on your own terms than to have it present itself at a moment when you couldn't afford it. She thought about the foyer 5 years ago, the cold marble floor, his voice. She thought about Lucas in the stairwell, reading in the near dark, and Rosa's hand over her mouth, and the specific quality of his face when she'd crossed the stairwell and held him. That small, instinctive settling of his, like a compass finding north. She thought about Damien in the lobby with the cut above his eyebrow, and Lucas asking if it hurt, and the thing that had moved across Damien's face, the way it had gone unguarded for a second. She sat with all of it. She didn't hurry it or sort it or file it away. The kettle boiled, she made her tea. Outside, the sky was beginning the slow process of becoming morning, that particular shift from black to dark blue that happened before anyone could honestly call it light. She thought, I am 34 years old. I built something real. My son is alive and unafraid in the next room. The people who came for my family are in federal custody, and the man who built the crisis has committed to dismantling it. She thought, this is not the life I would have chosen, given the choice. She thought, but I'm not destroyed by it, and that is not a small thing. 3 months passed before Lucas asked the question. It was a Saturday morning in September, the kind that comes to New York, in that specific window before the heat is fully gone, but the light has changed, lower, more golden, the city looking briefly like a painting of itself. Vivian was at the kitchen table in the brownstone going over the final terms of Nexar's London expansion. Lucas was at the counter eating cereal with the focused efficiency he brought to meals, working through a book propped against the orange juice carton. The man from the lobby, he said, without looking up. Vivian set down her pen. He was at the building last Tuesday when I came to visit you at work, Lucas said. He turned a page. You talked to him for a long time. She had, in fact, had a 40-minute conversation with Damien in the lobby of the Nexar building 3 weeks ago regarding the structure of his visitation arrangement and a specific legal document Marcus had drafted. Lucas had been in Vivian's office with her assistant and an impressive quantity of colored pencils. She had not known he'd seen them. Yes, she said. Lucas looked up. Is he my dad? She looked at her son. His eyes were steady and direct in the way they always were when he was asking something he'd been holding for a while. There was no drama in the question. He had simply arrived at it, the way he arrived at most things, through observation and patience and his own interior timeline. Yes, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Why doesn't he live here? Because he and I aren't married anymore. We were when you were going to be born. Then we weren't. And he didn't know you when you were a baby. She said it plainly because he deserved plainness. That was a mistake. Not yours. Ours. Grown-up mistakes that were bad for all of us. Lucas thought about this. He ate a spoonful of cereal. Does he want to know me? Yes, she said. How do you know? Because he told me. And because he's been showing up when I've allowed it, quietly, without making a big thing of it. He's been nearby. She paused. He's waiting for you to decide. Lucas looked back at his book. He appeared to read a paragraph. Then he set his spoon down. I want to meet him, Lucas said. Properly. Not just the lobby. Okay, she said. Can we do it somewhere I like? Not somewhere weird. Where do you like? The Science Museum, he said immediately. I'll arrange it, she said. He picked up his spoon and went back to his cereal. He turned another page. The morning light came through the window at its September angle and landed on the table and the orange juice carton in the side of his face. She picked up her pen. She went back to the London terms. Her hand was steady. The meeting at the Science Museum was awkward, in the specific way that important things are often awkward. Not painfully, not catastrophically, just with the natural friction of two people meeting for the first time while already being connected in the deepest possible way. Damien arrived before them. She'd told him to, so Lucas would see him waiting rather than arriving. He was standing near the entrance to the space exploration exhibit with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes on the door, and when they came in, Lucas stopped in the entrance hall and looked at him from a distance with that still assessing quality of his, and Damien looked back without moving toward them, understanding instinctively, or having been told, which amounted to the same thing, that this approach had to be the boys'. Lucas walked toward him. Vivian stayed near the entrance. She watched her son walk across the hall toward his father. She watched Damien crouch down when Lucas got close, not all the way to his knees, just enough to be at a less imposing height, the gesture of a man who had been thinking about what not to get wrong. She watched Lucas study him at close range. She couldn't hear what Lucas said first. It was something short. Damien answered. Lucas pointed toward the exhibit behind them, the space models, the ones she knew he'd been wanting to see for 2 months. And Damien nodded, and they went. She followed at a distance. She sat on a bench near the center of the exhibit hall and watched them move from display to display. She watched Lucas explain things. Because Lucas explained things, he didn't wait to be taught. He taught you, and any adult who understood this quickly earned his cooperation. She watched Damien listen. She watched him ask questions back. Not performed questions, not condescending ones, but questions that suggested he actually wanted to know the answer. She watched Lucas calibrate to this in real time, the way he calibrated to all new things, opening incrementally as the evidence of being taken seriously accumulated. By the time they reached the model of the solar system at the far end of the hall, Lucas was walking slightly closer to Damien than he'd started. She sat on her bench and looked at her hands. She thought about a charity auction and a borrowed dress, and a man who had laughed, surprised into it, ungracefully. She thought about the kitchen in October, both hands on either side of her face, and the word okay. She thought about 17 floors in an elevator and a march sidewalk and bare feet on cold marble. She thought, all of it happened. All of it was real. The love was real, and the betrayal was real, and the 5 years alone were real, and this moment is real. There is no version of this story where the bad parts didn't happen. There is only the version where you decide what you build on top of them. Damien glanced back at her from across the hall. Their eyes met for a moment. Nothing passed between them that required words. She gave him a small nod. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, maybe not ever all the way, but acknowledgement. Something that said, this matters. What you're doing right now, in this hall, with this child, it matters. He looked back at Lucas. The trial of Salvatore Greco began in November and lasted 3 weeks. Vivian followed it from a distance. Diane sent summaries, Marcus called with updates. But she did not attend. She had given her own statement in October, in a conference room with federal attorneys and a court reporter, and she had been precise and thorough and had not editorialized, and when it was done, she had driven back to the Nexar building and gone back to work. Sal was convicted on 12 counts. He was sentenced in February. The sentence was significant. The Caruso Network's federal case was still building, but 3 of the senior figures had already pleaded out, and the infrastructure had collapsed sufficiently that it was no longer operational in New York. The port routes Damien had controlled were subject to federal oversight pending the cooperation agreement's full term. Elena Vasquez's name came up twice in the trial, not as a defendant, but as context. She had left the country again. Vivian did not think about her much anymore. The woman who had walked through a door someone else opened was not the primary actor in that story. She was a detail in a larger machinery of ambition, and the machinery was what had been dismantled. Damien testified. He was on the stand for 2 days. She didn't watch it, but Rosa did, and told her about it afterward over coffee. How he'd been precise and flat, and had given nothing beyond what was asked, the way he always did in rooms where someone was trying to read him. How he'd answered questions about the timeline of his cooperation without flinching. How he'd answered one question about why he'd cooperated by saying, simply, that he had finally understood what he stood to lose, and had understood it too late to save everything, but not too late to save what mattered. Rosa had told her this part with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup and her eyes on Vivian's face. He meant Lucas, Vivian said. I know, Rosa said, and maybe more than that. Vivian looked at her coffee. Rosa. I'm not suggesting anything, Rosa said. I'm just telling you what I saw. I know what you're doing. I'm doing nothing, Rosa said, with the serenity of a woman who has perfected the art of technically telling the truth. Damien and Lucas met 7 times before the end of the year. The museum twice. The park once, which Lucas had been indifferent to. A bookstore, which Lucas had been overwhelmingly not indifferent to, and which Damien had navigated by the simple strategy of following wherever Lucas walked and paying for whatever Lucas wanted, which Vivian had told him afterward was not a replicable approach, and he'd said he understood and done the exact same thing the next time. She'd let it go. She'd chosen her battles. The 7th meeting was at the brownstone. Damien's first time inside it as something other than an emergency. He came on a Sunday afternoon and Lucas showed him the constellation map above his desk and explained 3 separate star systems in detail that was not entirely accurate but was delivered with such authority that Damien had nodded through all of it, and afterward Vivian had made dinner. The real kind this time, not canned pasta. And they had eaten at the kitchen table, the three of them, with Lucas conducting most of the conversation, and the two adults communicating in the careful, functional register of people who share something fundamental and have agreed on the shape of what that sharing looks like. After dinner, Lucas went to his room and Damien helped clear the table without being asked, which she noted, and then he stood near the sink with a dish towel that he didn't quite know what to do with, and she took it from him because she was not going to stand in her own kitchen and watch a man with a dish towel figure out its purpose. "He asked me what I do," Damien said. "What did you tell him?" "I said I'm reorganizing some businesses," which is true. He paused. He said it sounded boring. I told him it probably was. She put the dish towel on the rack. "He'll ask harder questions eventually." "I know." "You'll need actual answers." "I know," he said. "I'm working on what those look like." She looked at him. "Are you?" "Yes," he said. "I have a foundation. It's in the early stages, funding families displaced by organized crime specifically. There's a legal component, an economic component. I've been talking to people who work in the field about structure." He said this in the flat, factual tone he used for things he wasn't sure he had the right to be proud of yet. "It's not penance. I don't think penance is a useful framework. It's just the most direct thing I can think of to do with what I have and what I know." She thought about this for a moment. "That's a better answer than I expected." "I've been working on better," he said. She picked up her own coffee cup. She looked at the kitchen, the ordinary, specific reality of it, the constellation map visible through the open doorway, the small blue lamplight edging under Lucas's door upstairs. Her kitchen, her house. Her son's voice coming faintly from upstairs, talking to himself the way he did when he was happy. "I need to say something to you," she said, "and I need you to just listen, not respond, not explain, just listen." He set down the dish towel. He looked at her. "What was done to our marriage," she said, "was done deliberately by people who understood your weaknesses and exploited them. I understand that. I've understood it for months and I've had time to process what it means." She paused. "It doesn't change the night. It doesn't give me back the years. It doesn't change what Lucas grew up without or what I had to do alone. Those things happened regardless of who engineered the conditions for them." She stopped, breathed. "But it is part of the full picture, and I am someone who needs the full picture, even when parts of it complicate the cleaner story." He said nothing. He was listening. "I don't forgive you completely," she said. "I don't think that's where I am, and I don't think it serves either of us for me to pretend otherwise. But I don't carry it the way I used to. The weight is different now." She held her coffee cup and looked at the table. "I think the weight will keep changing. I think that's what happens." "Yes," he said quietly. "I'm not telling you this so you feel better," she said. "I'm telling you because Lucas will ask me someday how I feel about his father, and I want my answer to be true. I want it to be complicated and true, rather than simple and wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "What will you tell him?" She thought. "That his father made decisions that caused a lot of harm. That some of those decisions were made under conditions that weren't entirely his fault. That he spent several years understanding what he'd done, and then he spent more years trying to be something different." She paused. "That I believe a person can change if the change is real and not performed. And that I watched his father change, not cleanly, not completely, but genuinely." She looked up. "That's what I'll tell him." Damien looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was tight. His hands were still. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "Earn it, every day, with him." "Yes," he said. The years after that did not resolve themselves into something clean. That was the honest thing. Clean was for stories that ended before the complicated part. Life, Vivian had learned, operated differently. Nexar went public in the spring. The IPO was covered extensively. There was a photograph taken outside the exchange, Vivian in the doorway, Lucas beside her in a jacket that was slightly too big for him because he'd grown 2 inches since she'd bought it, both of them looking at something off camera. Lucas with his book under his arm because he'd refused to leave it in the car. The photograph ran in the financial press and was shared more widely than financial photographs usually were. People who wrote about it noted the composed certainty in her face. They talked about her trajectory, her company, her resilience. They didn't know about the borrowed dress or the cold marble floor. They didn't know about the stairwell or the April kitchen or the dish towel. Damien hadn't known what to do with. They didn't know about the 17 floors in the elevator and the promise she'd made herself on the March sidewalk. She didn't need them to. She knew. Lucas was 8 by the time Damien's foundation was fully operational. By then, he'd already asked the harder questions Vivian had predicted. Asked them at unpredictable moments, the way Lucas did everything, according to a timetable that was entirely interior. He asked Damien on a walk in the park why he hadn't been there when Lucas was a baby. He asked it without apparent anger, just the same direct perceptiveness he'd been born with. Damien had stopped walking. He had looked at the middle distance for a moment. Then he'd sat down on a park bench and answered the question honestly, in language calibrated to an 8-year-old, without softening it past usefulness or burdening it past what a child should carry. He said he had made a very bad choice during a very hard time, and that the choice had hurt people he loved, and that he had not understood the full size of the mistake until too late to fix the worst of it. He said he was sorry in a way that did not ask Lucas to make him feel better about being sorry. Lucas had listened. He'd sat beside him on the bench with his book in his lap. Then he'd said, "Okay, are we still going to the bookstore after this?" "Yes," Damien said. "Good," Lucas said, and stood up. They had gone to the bookstore. Vivian, walking 4 steps behind them, had let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for years. By the time Lucas was 10, he knew what his father had been. Not entirely. There was information he would receive in stages, as he was old enough to hold it, but the shape of it. He'd asked Vivian one night why some things Damien had done were illegal, and she'd sat with him on the edge of his bed and told him the truth, in the only way she knew how to tell things, straight and whole, and without protecting herself from his reaction to it. But he'd been quiet for a while after. Then he said, "But he changed." "Yes," she said. "How do you know it's real?" She thought about it. "Because the change is inconvenient for him," she said. "Because it cost him things he didn't have to give up. Because nobody's watching most of the time when he does it." She paused. "That's usually how you know." Lucas thought about this. He had his father's stillness and his mother's clarity and a mind that neither of them could fully account for. He would grow up to be someone specific. She could already see the edges of who. "Okay," he said, and went to sleep. The city was different at sunrise than at any other time. Vivian knew this the way you know things you've accumulated slowly, not through a single moment of understanding, but through years of early mornings in a life that had never much accommodated sleeping in. She had stood at windows in New York, in the 4 o'clock dark enough times, to understand the particular way the sky shifted, the order in which the darkness resolved itself, the moment when the buildings stopped being silhouettes and became themselves again. She stood at the window of the brownstone on a morning in October, a decade after the marble floor and the March sidewalk, and watched the city come back to itself. She was 39. She had built something real. Her son was asleep upstairs, and in 4 hours he would wake up and eat cereal and read and ask her something. She'd have to look up, and she would look it up, and that was the specific ordinary texture of her days, and she had earned every square inch of it. Damien was rebuilding in the only way available to him, slowly, in the direction of something redeemable, without the expectation of recognition. She had watched him do it year by year, and she had respected it the way you respect a thing that is genuinely hard and genuinely chosen. She did not love him the way she once had. She did not know if she loved him at all in the romantic sense anymore. The wiring of that had been disrupted too many times to simply be reconnected. But she knew him. She understood him, and she had found, surprisingly, that there was a kind of peace available in that. Not warmth exactly, not the kitchen in October, or the charity auction, or the couch with her feet in his lap. Something quieter. The peace of a shared weight, shared honestly. Lucas would carry pieces of both of them. He already did. She could see it in the way he was still and observant like his father, and relentless and clear-eyed like her, and she thought, maybe that is what this was always building toward. Not the two of them. Him. This specific person, assembled from everything that went wrong and everything that held. She stood at the window and the city turned pale and then gold at the edges. She thought about the promise she'd made on the sidewalk. She had kept it. It had not been easy, and it had not been linear, and there had been years inside it that she would not describe as anything but survival. But she had kept it. Her son would know who he was because of who she'd become, not because of one night. She thought that was enough. She thought actually it was more than enough. The sun came fully up. The city became itself again, lit and irreversible and indifferent and magnificent. And Vivian Carter stood in the light of it and let herself be finished with the war, completely and at last, and turned away from the window to start the coffee and wake her son. Rosa's cousin's place in New Jersey was a small ranch house in a subdivision that had been built in the 80s and hadn't changed much since. Low ceilings, carpet the color of old moss, a kitchen with appliances that had been new when someone's mother was still alive. It smelled like cedar and closed rooms and the particular neutrality of a house that nobody lived in full-time. Lucas declared it acceptable. He found the couch, determined it was the right kind of firm, and was reading again within 4 minutes of arrival. Rosa made tea, nobody drank. Diane called twice with updates. Caruso had been picked up at a motel outside Newark at 9 that evening, a federal operation coordinated with 3 field offices, quiet and fast and without incident. The network's collapse, once it started, had the quality of a structure that had been load-bearing on one crucial wall and had lost it. Everything that had appeared solid came down in sequence. By midnight, the federal liaison had called Marcus directly to confirm that the immediate threat to Vivian and Lucas was neutralized. By 1 in the morning, Sal Greco had been processed and transferred and was in a federal facility in Lower Manhattan, where he would spend the next several years preparing to answer for what he'd built. Vivian sat on the back step of the house with a cup of tea that had gone cold and listened to the New Jersey night, which was different from the New York night, quieter, more insistent about its own quietness. The highway sound a distant suggestion rather than a constant fact. The yard was small and fenced, and the grass needed cutting, and there was a rusted bird feeder on a pole that had been empty for a long time. She heard the back door open behind her. Damien sat down on the step beside her. He'd cleaned the cut above his eye. Someone had found a bandage for it. Rosa, probably, who kept a first aid kit in her bag the way other people kept breath mints. He was still in his jacket. He looked like a man at the end of a very long road who hadn't decided yet whether he was allowed to stop walking. They sat without talking for a while. The night absorbed it. "Is he asleep?" Vivian said finally. "Rosa's reading to him," Damien said. He corrected her pronunciation twice. Despite everything, something moved in her face. "He does that." "I noticed." A pause. "He's extraordinary," Damien said. The word came out carefully, like he was handling something he didn't fully trust himself with. "Yes," she said. "He is." "That's you," he said. "What you did. What you built for him. That's entirely you." She looked at the empty bird feeder. "It's him too. He came that way." Another silence. Longer. A car passed on the street out front, and its headlights briefly lit the side of the house, and then the dark came back. "I need to say something," Damien said. "I know." "Let me say it anyway," he said, "even if you already know it." She said nothing, which was permission. He leaned forward, forearms on his knees, looking at the yard. "I have spent 5 years telling myself that I made a choice, that I chose Elena, that it was mine to make, and I made it wrong, and that was the sum of it." He paused. "Finding out about Sal, finding out what Elena was, what she was part of. I thought it would make it easier. I thought it would change the weight of it somehow, make me less responsible for what I did." "Does it?" she said. "No," he said, "because I still walked you out of that house. Nobody made me do that. Sal engineered the conditions, and Elena said the right things at the right moments, and I still made the choice, and I made it without... I didn't fight for you. I didn't look hard enough at what was happening. I just..." He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. "I just let you go." The yard was quiet. "You did," she said. "I know that an apology is..." He stopped again. "I know there's no version of 'I'm sorry' that covers what you had to carry alone. I'm not offering it as payment. I need you to know that I understand what I did. Fully. Not the managed version of it, not the version where Sal takes half the weight. What I did." She looked at the side of his face, the bandage above his eye, the lines around his mouth that hadn't been there 5 years ago. He was 43 and he looked like a man who had paid for things with his body and his time and his choices, and she was 38 and she had paid for things too, in different currency, and she thought, we are both exactly as old as what we've been through, no older, no younger. I know you understand it, she said. That's not the same as it being repaired. I know. I'm not going to forgive you tonight, she said. Not because I can't, because forgiveness isn't a transaction, and I'm not going to hand it over in a backyard in New Jersey at 1 in the morning while we're both running on nothing. I'm not asking for tonight, he said. Then what are you asking for? He turned and looked at her. Lucas, he said. I want to know him. I want the chance to be someone he can know. Not impose myself, not demand anything, just... He stopped. I want to earn it, whatever that looks like. She held this for a moment. He doesn't know who you are, she said. I know. When I tell him, and I will tell him, on my timeline, in the way I decide is right, it's going to be complicated. He's going to have questions I can't fully answer and feelings I can't predict. I understand. And whatever he decides about you, she said, is his to decide. Not mine to manage and not yours to influence. If he wants nothing to do with you, you accept that. Yes. And if he wants to know you, you show up, she said. Not when it's convenient, not when your schedule allows. You show up the way parents show up, for the ordinary things, not just the crises, the school things, and the boring Tuesday evenings, and the times when he's difficult, and the times when he doesn't want to talk. Yes, he said. She looked at him for a moment longer, then she looked back at the yard. I'll think about how to do this, she said. I'm not saying yes tonight. I'm saying I'll think about it. He nodded. It was enough. She could see that it was enough for him, and she noted that, the fact that he wasn't pushing, wasn't pressing the opening she'd given him, and filed it without deciding what it meant. Where will you go, she said. After this, when the federal cooperation is done and the organization is... There are properties, he said, legitimate ones, real estate, some freight logistics. I can live on those. A pause. I've been thinking about a foundation. There are families damaged by organized crime, by the specific ways those structures work, children who grew up in it. I know what that looks like from the inside. I have money and I'll have time. She was quiet for a moment. That's not penance, he said, reading her silence. I know how it sounds. It doesn't sound like penance, she said. It sounds like a man trying to figure out what to do with himself. That's probably accurate, he said. She stood up, picked up her cold tea. Get some sleep, she said. Rosa made up the couch. Vivian. She stopped. Thank you, he said, for letting me be here today. She didn't answer that. She went inside. She told Lucas in November. Not all of it. He was 5, so there was a version appropriate to 5, and there was the rest, which he would get in pieces over the years as he grew into the capacity to hold it. What she told him was the essential truth, stripped of what he didn't need yet. That the man he'd met in Rosa's lobby with the cut on his face was his father. That his father and she were not together and hadn't been for a long time. That his father wanted to know him, if Lucas was open to that. Lucas had listened to this with his characteristic stillness, sitting across from her at the kitchen table in the brownstone with his hands flat on the tabletop and his eyes on her face, reading her the way he read everything, for what was actually there, not just what was said. Why didn't I know before? He asked. Because I needed to make sure things were safe first, she said, and because I wasn't sure how. Are things safe now? Yes. He thought about this. Is he good? She held the question for a moment. He's trying to be, she said. He made some bad choices when he was younger. He knows that. Like what? He'll tell you himself someday, she said. When you're older and you want to know. Lucas looked at his hands, then back up at her. Can I meet him again? If you want to. Okay, he said. I want to. She called Damien that evening. She told him what Lucas had said. There was a long silence on his end of the phone. Okay, he said. His voice was rougher than she'd heard it in a while. Saturday afternoon, she said. The park near the brownstone. I'll be there. It's not a private introduction. I'm not ready for that. I understand. He may have a lot of questions, or he may have none. Don't push either way. I won't. She paused. And Damien, he's perceptive. He'll know if you're performing. Don't perform. A pause. I don't know what I am with him, he said. I know, she said. Just be honest about that. He respects honesty. He's had a lot of it. She hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment, and the brownstone was quiet around her, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she'd just set in motion, not with dread, but with the particular seriousness of a decision that was irreversible and right. Yes. Saturday was cold and bright, the November light flat and clean off the park's bare trees. Lucas wore his red jacket, the one with the broken zipper she kept meaning to fix. He walked beside her with his hands in his pockets and his breath making small clouds. And when they came around the bend in the path, and Damien was there, sitting on a bench, watching them approach with the absolute stillness of a man trying to control every variable of himself. Lucas slowed slightly. Vivian slowed with him. Lucas looked at Damien. Damien looked at Lucas. "Hi," Lucas said. "Hi," Damien said. A pause. "Your cut healed," Lucas said. Something moved through Damien's face. It did. "I have a scar on my knee from when I fell off my bike," Lucas said. "It doesn't hurt anymore." "Scars usually stop hurting," Damien said. Lucas considered this with great seriousness. "Usually," he agreed. Vivian stood back slightly and watched her son sit down on the bench beside the man who had made him, and watched the two of them look out at the park in a silence that had none of the weight of adult silence. It was just a boy and a man sitting near each other on a cold November day. And she pressed her hands together inside her coat pockets and breathed. She did not cry. She had done her crying in private, in pieces, over the 5 years that had led here, and she was not going to do it now in a public park. But something in her settled in a way that was permanent, some long-held tension releasing like a cable finally cut. She sat on the other end of the bench. The three of them watched a dog chase a squirrel across the path. Lucas laughed, the unguarded laugh of a child who hasn't decided yet whether something is funny, then decided yes. Damien looked at him when he laughed and looked away. They were there for an hour. The months that followed were not easy, and she would not have trusted them if they had been. There were Saturday afternoons that went well and Saturday afternoons that didn't. Afternoons where Lucas was tired or difficult or had decided he didn't want to be there, and Vivian had to manage the complicated question of respecting his autonomy while not letting him use it to avoid something she believed, in the long view, he needed. There were phone calls with Damien that were purely logistical, and phone calls that veered into the harder territory of what they were building and whether it was what they'd intended and how to course correct when it wasn't. Damien was better at this than she'd expected. Not effortlessly. She could see the effort, which was different from watching him pretend there was none. He made mistakes. He said the wrong thing to Lucas once about school, applying pressure he hadn't recognized as pressure. And Lucas had shut down in the specific way he shut down when he felt managed. And Vivian had called Damien afterward and told him directly, and he'd listened and he'd called Lucas the next day and acknowledged it plainly, without over-explaining, and Lucas had accepted it with the same directness, and they'd moved on. That moment had told her more than a year of good behavior would have. The federal cooperation had taken the better part of a year. She had not been part of it and hadn't wanted to be, but Marcus had kept her generally informed on the things that were relevant to her. The Caruso Network's prosecution, Sal Greco's plea, the status of various dismantled operations. The proceedings were not dramatic. They were paperwork and testimony, and the slow machinery of the legal system doing what it did. Damien had cooperated completely. His attorney had told Marcus that Damien had voluntarily expanded the scope of his cooperation twice beyond what the immunity agreement required. Turning over information he didn't need to turn over. Marcus had told her this in passing, not as advocacy, just as information. She had noted it. The piece in the Times ran on a Tuesday morning in March, almost exactly 3 years to the week from the night she'd stood on a Fifth Avenue sidewalk with her coat unbuttoned in the cold and made herself a promise. She found it on her phone before she'd gotten out of bed, reading with her pillow still dented and the brownstone quiet around her. It was a profile of Nexar's expansion into municipal infrastructure, smart city contracts with 4 mid-sized American cities, a partnership with a federal housing initiative, projections that had the finance press running numbers they hadn't predicted 2 years ago. The journalist had done a good job. She'd found the shape of the story, not the rags to riches framing Vivian avoided, not the single mother triumph narrative she found reductive, but the actual story, which was about a woman who had built systems for cities that the cities hadn't known they needed yet. There was a photograph. She looked competent and slightly tired, which was accurate. She put her phone down and got up and started coffee and went to get Lucas for school. He was already awake, reading, jacket already half on because he'd decided he could read and dress simultaneously, which was not going as well as he'd planned. She stood in the doorway of his room and watched him struggle with the second sleeve without losing his page, and felt the ordinary love of it. Not overwhelming, just constant, like weather. "You're going to be late," she said. "Almost," he said. "Lucas." "One more sentence." She waited. He finished his sentence, folded the corner of the page. She had tried for years to get him to use bookmarks. She had surrendered, and stood up and got the second sleeve on. "Dad's coming Saturday," he said, casual. The way he'd started saying it, Dad, the word arrived like it was his own, which it was. "I know," she said. "He's taking you to that science thing at the museum." "The astrophysics one," Lucas said, with the specific emphasis of a 6-year-old who knew the difference. "He said he doesn't know much about it." "He doesn't," Vivian said. "That's okay," Lucas said, with a generosity that was entirely his own. "I can explain it." She looked at him. Red jacket, broken zipper she'd finally fixed, backpack hanging off one shoulder, entirely ready to go explain astrophysics to his father, and she thought, there you are. There's the thing that was worth every single day of it. "Come on," she said. "Breakfast." She saw Damien in December, at Lucas's school winter performance. He was already there when she arrived, standing near the back of the auditorium in the way he stood in rooms, aware of everything, taking up deliberate space. He'd come alone. He was wearing a coat she didn't recognize, and he looked better than he had in March of the previous year. Not younger, just less burdened. She had learned to read the difference. They stood near each other through the performance without much conversation. Lucas was in the second row of the choir, and he sang with the particular reluctance of a boy who considered singing slightly beneath his dignity, but had agreed to do it because his mother had asked. When he found them in the audience, he made a face that communicated this reluctance clearly. Vivian made a face back that communicated that he was doing fine. Damien laughed. Quietly, to himself. The laugh surprised out of him the way she'd first heard him laugh at a charity auction 14 years ago in a borrowed dress. Ungraceful, real, not performed. She did not remark on it. Afterward, in the lobby, Lucas came out of the backstage area still in his choir robe and went directly to Damien and said, "Did you see the thing at the end where Marcus dropped his sheet music?" "I saw it," Damien said. "He does that at rehearsal too," Lucas said, with the authority of insider knowledge. They were deep in this analysis when Rosa appeared at Vivian's elbow. Rosa looked at Damien and Lucas and then looked at Vivian with the expression of a woman exercising considerable restraint. "Don't," Vivian said. "I'm not saying anything," Rosa said. "You're saying everything." "They look alike," Rosa said very quietly. "That's all." Vivian looked at them, her son and the man who had made him, standing together in a school lobby in matching postures, both slightly tilted toward each other, both listening with the particular quality of the Moretti stillness that she'd once catalogued as power and now recognized as simply the way they were built. They did look alike. She had known they would. She had prepared herself for it, and it had landed anyway, every time, like a fact that had no interest in her preparedness. "I know," she said to Rosa. "Are you okay?" She thought about this honestly. "Yes," she said. "I think I actually am." Rosa put her arm through Vivian's, and they watched the lobby together for a moment. She and Damien had one last real conversation about the past. Just one. She had not planned it, and she suspected he hadn't either. It happened in April, on a Sunday, after he'd brought Lucas home from an afternoon at the Science Museum. Lucas had gone upstairs with an armful of pamphlets he intended to read before dinner. Damien was at the front door, coat on, and she was holding the door, and he paused. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She waited. "Do you regret it?" he said. "Any of it." She understood what he meant. Not their marriage, not the end of it, the whole thing. The life she'd had to build from the sidewalk up, the years of doing it alone. She looked past him at the street. The April afternoon was pale and mild, and the trees on the block were just beginning to come in, that early green that hadn't committed to anything yet. I regret that Lucas didn't have both of us from the beginning, she said. I regret that he lost time with you that he can't get back. I regret that I had nights when I wasn't sure I was going to make it, and there was nobody there, and I regret that he had nights when I couldn't hide how hard it was, and he could feel it. She looked back at Damien. I don't regret what I built, she said, and I don't regret who I became. I needed to become her. I just wish the cost had been different. He held this. I'm sorry, he said. Not the performed apology of their early conversations, just the plain fact of it, offered without expectation. I know, she said. Is there... He stopped. Is there anything between us that you... He stopped again. She looked at him for a long moment, at the man she had loved with the kind of love that didn't know when to stop, and who had stood in a foyer and made a choice, and who had spent 5 years becoming someone else in the wake of it, and who was now standing on her front step, having built the only thing she'd actually asked of him, a version of himself that her son could know. No, she said. It was not cruel. It was just true. That closed. I don't carry it the way I used to, Damien. I'm not angry. She shook her head slightly. You can't rebuild the same thing from different materials. It would just be something that looked like what it was. He nodded. She watched his face accept it. Not collapse, just accept. The way you accept a weather forecast you can't change. Okay, he said. But this, she said, and gestured between them and then upward toward the sound of Lucas moving around in his room overhead. This I want to protect, what we're building for him. That's real. That's real, he agreed. He said goodnight. She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment and listened to the house. Lucas overhead, the sound of pamphlets being sorted with great seriousness, the small domestic sounds of an ordinary Sunday evening. And she felt the full, quiet weight of it. Not happiness exactly, though happiness was in it. Something more durable than happiness. Something that had been built rather than received, and therefore couldn't be taken back. The years move the way years do when you are building something. Not fast, not slow, but with the particular purposefulness of time that is being used rather than spent. Nexar reached its 10th year as a company on a Tuesday morning, and Vivian marked it by getting Lucas to school on time and going to the office and sitting through 3 meetings and eating a salad at her desk. And Rosa called at noon to say that was the least celebratory 10-year anniversary she'd ever heard of. And Vivian laughed and said she'd have champagne with dinner, and Rosa said that was marginally better. Lucas turned 10 and could explain dark matter with a clarity that made his physics teacher send a note home. He turned 11 and decided he was interested in architecture, then reconsidered, then landed on materials science, which Vivian suspected would change again before he was done. He was reading at a college level by the time he was 12. He was also, at 12, profoundly interested in basketball and deeply committed to being mediocre at it, which Vivian considered the healthiest possible development. Damien came to the games. Everyone. He sat in the bleachers with the other parents and cheered with no self-consciousness and fetched terrible concession stand popcorn and learned the names of Lucas's teammates and their parents and was, in the specific way of school bleacher parents, unremarkably present. Vivian sat elsewhere in those bleachers, not far, and they talked before and after with the ease of 2 people who have settled the hardest things and arrived at something they could both live inside. He had started the foundation in his 2nd year after the federal cooperation ended. It was small at first, funding programs for families affected by organized crime, working with social services on child welfare cases in communities where criminal networks had been dismantled, and the vacuum was as damaging as the network had been. He was not the face of it. He had learned, late and at cost, that some debts were not paid through visibility. She heard about the work through Marcus occasionally, and through pieces in regional papers, and once through a woman at a conference who mentioned the Moretti Foundation without knowing who Vivian was, saying only that it was doing serious work in 3 cities with none of the performative quality of similar initiatives. Vivian had said she'd heard that and moved the conversation on. She told Rosa later. Rosa had made the face she made when she was trying not to say something that would start an argument she didn't have time for. What? Vivian said. Nothing, Rosa said. Rosa. I think you did that, Rosa said. Whatever he became. I think you did that. Vivian shook her head. He did that himself. You showed him it was possible, Rosa said, by doing it first. Vivian looked at her. That's not the same thing as doing it. No, Rosa said. But it's not nothing either. The last scene she would remember. Not the last scene in time, but the one that settled into permanent memory as the image of what all of it had added up to, happened on a Sunday evening in October when Lucas was 13. Damien had brought him home after a weekend. They'd gone upstate, some museum Lucas had researched and organized transportation to with the characteristic thoroughness of a boy who did not trust adults to handle logistics. They came in through the front door talking about something she could hear but not quite make out. Lucas still in his coat, Damien behind him, both of them carrying the particular ease of two people who have built their own language over time. She was in the kitchen finishing the last of the weekend paperwork. "Mom," Lucas said, coming to the kitchen doorway. "We saw a wolf." She looked up. A wolf? At the wildlife center. They were doing a demonstration. He pulled out his phone and found a photograph. She looked at it. A gray wolf at perhaps 10 feet, photographed with Lucas's characteristic directness. No framing, just the animal and the fence and the winter grass behind. "That's a wolf," she agreed. "Dad said wolves mate for life," Lucas said. "Is that true?" She looked up past Lucas to where Damien was standing, slightly back from the doorway, and his eyes met hers over the top of their son's head, and in his face was the complicated thing she recognized by now. The gratitude and the grief and the acceptance all living together. The face of a man who had stopped arguing with the terms of what he'd been given and was working with them instead. "Some species do," she said. "I'd check that one." Lucas had already pulled up the information on his phone. "Actually, it's a common misconception," he said, reading. "Wolves form pair bonds, but they're not necessarily permanent." "There you go," she said. He put his phone away, satisfied with the correction. He went upstairs to unpack. She and Damien were briefly alone in the kitchen doorway. "Good weekend?" she said. "Good weekend," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The years were in both their faces, not as damage, but as record. The thing you carry that also carries you, if you're not too proud to let it. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it, for how you did this." She shook her head slightly. She didn't need thanks. "Go home, Damien." He nodded. He said goodnight. She heard the front door close. She stood in the kitchen for a moment with the evening coming in through the window over the sink, the city light turning the sky its particular amber. And upstairs, Lucas was moving around in his room, and the house was the house she had built, and her son was the person she had made possible, and the woman she'd been on a March sidewalk with no coat, and a child inside her was also somehow here, in this kitchen, in this life, in the full and imperfect thing she had managed to construct from the wreckage of someone else's worst choice. She picked up her pen. She went back to work. Outside, the city carried on in its indifferent, magnificent way, full of people beginning things and ending things and living inside the long middle of them, and the skyline held its light against the dark the way it always did. Not triumphant, just persistent, just there, doing what it was built to do. Which, in the end, was enough. Which had always been enough.